The look on her face when the room went completely silent was something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She had been mid-sentence, holding her wine glass, smiling at her guests the way she always did, like a woman who had never once been told no. And then the silence hit her, and the smile dissolved. My name is Margaret Calloway. I am 64 years old. I spent 31 years as an auditor with the Canada Revenue Agency, and on the night of my daughter's engagement dinner, I did what I had done for 3 decades. I followed the numbers, and the numbers told me everything. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. My daughter Claire called me on a Tuesday evening in late October. I was in the kitchen making a pot of soup, the kind of thick lentil soup her father used to love before he passed. She called me on video because she always called on video, even when she was just telling me something small. I knew by the brightness in her eyes before she even spoke that this was not small. "Mom," she said, "I need to tell you something." She was 33 years old, a grade 4 teacher at a public school in Kingston, Ontario. She had her father's patience and his laugh, the kind that started in her eyes before it ever reached her mouth. She had been teaching for 9 years, the kind of teacher parents requested by name, the kind the kids drew pictures of and brought apples to on the first day of school. I had never been more proud of a person in my life. "I met someone," she said, "a few months ago. I have been waiting to tell you because I wanted to be sure." His name was Daniel Forsyth. He was 36, a civil engineer who worked at his family's development firm, Forsyth Partners, based in Kingston but with projects across eastern Ontario and into Quebec. His father, Gerald Forsyth, had built the company over 30 years from a small contracting outfit into one of the largest private development firms in the region. Gerald sat on the board of the Kingston Chamber of Commerce. His wife, Pamela, chaired the gala for the Kingston General Hospital Foundation every year without fail. "He sounds kind," I said carefully. "He is, Mom. He actually is. He is not like the others. He is the kind of person who remembers what you said 3 weeks ago and asks about it." I believed her because she had good instincts about people, always had. But I had also been an auditor long enough to know that the most polished surfaces sometimes hide the deepest cracks. I met Daniel for the first time in November at a Sunday dinner at Claire's apartment on Princess Street. He was tall, sandy-haired, with a firm handshake and an easy manner. He asked me what I had done at the CRA, with genuine curiosity, not the vague politeness most people perform when they don't actually want to know. He listened when I explained what auditing municipal infrastructure contracts looked like. He nodded in the right places. He helped clear the table without being asked. I liked him. I told myself to leave it at that. They got engaged in February. On a frozen Saturday afternoon at Lake Ontario's edge, near the waterfront park, he had brought a thermos of hot coffee and a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Claire called me from the park, her breath visible in the cold air, crying and laughing at the same time. I cried too, standing in my kitchen in Belleville with the phone pressed to my ear. That evening after I hung up, I sat with a cup of tea and let myself feel the fullness of it. My daughter was happy. That was what mattered. The engagement dinner was held in March, at the Forsyth home in the west end of Kingston. The house was a stone Victorian on a quiet residential street, the kind of property that had been in the same family for generations. Gerald met us at the door. He was in his mid-60s, broad-shouldered, with the self-assurance of a man who had never had to ask twice for anything. He shook my hand and said, "Margaret, wonderful to meet you," in the tone of someone who had already decided the meeting was a formality. Pamela was in the kitchen directing the catering staff. She appeared in the hallway wearing a cream blazer and a string of pearls, and she looked at Claire, and then at me, with an expression I recognized from years of sitting across tables from people who had already made up their minds before the conversation started. "Margaret," she said, "so lovely. Claire tells us you were a government employee. How nice that you stayed with it for so long. There is real security in the public sector, isn't there?" It was not a question. We were shown into a large dining room. There were 12 guests, mostly Forsyth family friends, a few couples from their country club, Daniel's younger sister and her husband. I sat beside Claire and watched Pamela work the room, refilling drinks, touching arms, laughing at the right moments. She was very good at it. The dinner itself was fine. Gerald talked about a new condominium development in Napanee, a mixed-use project they were particularly proud of. Someone asked about timelines, and Gerald said it was coming along beautifully, that Forsyth Partners always delivered on time, always to standard. The table nodded with the comfortable confidence of people who had no reason to doubt. After dinner, Gerald stood and raised his glass. He spoke warmly about Daniel, about legacy, about what it meant to bring a new person into the family. Then he sat down and Pamela stood. "I want to say something about our future daughter-in-law," she said. She smiled at Claire. It was a perfect smile, calibrated to look warm. "Claire is a wonderful girl. Daniel tells me she is very dedicated to her students. That kind of work ethic is admirable. It is not the path we imagined for Daniel, of course. We had always hoped for someone from a similar background, someone who understood the particular pressures and responsibilities that come with managing a family enterprise of this size. But Daniel has made his choice, and we support him. I am sure Claire will grow into the role. It simply takes time to learn a different world." She raised her glass. To Daniel and Claire. Everyone drank. Most of the table was already moving on, reaching for their wine, resuming side conversations. But I looked at Claire. Her jaw was set. She was smiling the way she smiled when she was holding something back. She caught my eye for just a moment and then looked away. She had been told without being told. She was welcome to attend. She was not expected to belong. I drove home to Belleville that night on the 401 with the radio off. I was not angry, not exactly. What I felt was closer to recognition. I had spent 31 years in a government office surrounded by men like Gerald Forsyth, men who built empires and kept everything neat on the surface. The surface was always the point. It was what you couldn't see from the surface that mattered. I started looking the following week, not because I had found anything, because I was someone who had spent 3 decades understanding that the absence of visible problems was not the same as the absence of problems. I began with what was public. Forsyth Partners had a significant footprint in regional procurement. Several of their contracts were municipal, funded in part through provincial infrastructure programs. I knew how those programs worked. I had audited several like them during my last decade at the CRA. I requested documents through Freedom of Information, which I had done hundreds of times over my career, and which most people do not realize they are fully entitled to do. I searched the Ontario Court Registry for civil filings. I cross-referenced the company's registered directors against addresses in the provincial land titles database. It took 3 weeks before I found the first thread. Forsyth Partners had been awarded a road resurfacing contract in Frontenac County 2 years earlier, funded through a federal-provincial cost-sharing agreement. The contract value was listed at $2.4 million, but a FOI request to the county turned up payment records totaling $3.1 million. The difference had been authorized through a series of change orders, each one just below the threshold requiring independent review. In procurement, change orders are standard. But a pattern of change orders that consistently stay just under oversight thresholds is not standard, it is technique. I took the documents to an old colleague, a retired auditor named Frank, who now did independent consulting from a small office on Front Street in Belleville. I laid everything out on his desk without telling him whose company it was. Frank studied the papers for a long time. Then he took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Whoever structured this knew exactly what they were doing," he said. "These aren't accidents. These are deliberate." I asked him how long something like this could have been running. He thought about it. 5 years, he said. Maybe more. If the pattern holds. I hired a private investigator. His name was Robert, semi-retired from the OPP, who ran a small agency out of Trenton. I explained what I had found and what I was looking for. He quoted me a fee that I agreed to without negotiating because time mattered more to me than money. Over the next 4 weeks, Robert found things I had not looked for. Gerald Forsyth had been involved in a relationship with a woman in Ottawa for at least 8 years. She was 41, a project manager who had worked on 2 municipal contracts where Forsyth Partners had been the successful bidder. Those contracts had been reviewed internally by her office before the public tender process. Robert had documented 4 trips Gerald had taken to Ottawa over the previous 14 months that did not appear on any company records. There was more. 2 former subcontractors had filed small claims against Forsyth Partners for unpaid invoices, both settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements. A structural engineer who had inspected one of their commercial builds in 2021 had written a report recommending remediation work on the foundation. The work had never been completed. The building had since been sold to a private investor who had no knowledge of the report. I paid Robert. I thanked him. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I called Claire that evening. We talked for an hour about her class, about the spring garden she was planning on her balcony, about Daniel. She sounded happy. She sounded like herself. When she asked me how I was doing, I told her I was fine. I was still trying to decide something. The formal engagement party was planned for the third Saturday in May at the Forsyth home. Pamela had organized everything. 200 guests, a catering company from Toronto, a jazz quartet, invitations printed on cardstock that felt expensive when you held it. Claire had asked me to come early, to be there when guests arrived. I arrived at 2 o'clock. Claire met me at the door and hugged me and told me I looked wonderful in my gray dress. I had brought a small arrangement of tulips. She took them and smiled. Something in her face had changed over the winter. She was still bright, still warm, but there was a careful quality to her smile now, something practiced. She was learning to perform for this house. The party filled up. Gerald moved through the room with a politician's ease, shaking hands, making brief and effective conversation. Daniel stayed close to Claire, his hand finding the small of her back the way it always did, and I watched him and I believed he loved her. That part at least was real. Then Pamela took the microphone. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked about family and legacy, about what the Forsyth name meant in this community. She talked about how Daniel had always known his own mind, even as a child. And then she turned to Claire. When Daniel first told me he was serious about Claire, I'll be honest with you all, I had questions. Our family has certain obligations, certain expectations that come with what we've built. It takes a particular kind of person to carry that. But I've watched Claire this winter, and she's trying. She's learning. And I think, with time and the right guidance, she'll find her footing. We're giving her every opportunity to become part of what we are here. Polite applause. A few knowing smiles exchanged across the room. Someone near me murmured, "How gracious." I looked at Claire. Her chin was up. Her eyes were bright in the way that meant she was fighting tears. Daniel's hand was still on her back. He had not moved, had not said anything. He was looking at his own feet. She had stood in that room in her own name and been assessed like a renovation project. I stood up. Pamela noticed me from the front. There was a small pause, and then, with enormous social confidence, she gestured graciously. "Margaret, did you want to say a few words?" "Yes," I said. "I did." I walked to the front of the room. Someone handed me the microphone. I looked out at 200 faces, most of whom I did not know. "My name is Margaret Calloway. I'm Claire's mother. I spent 31 years as an auditor with the Canada Revenue Agency. I processed infrastructure contracts, municipal procurement files, and financial compliance reviews. It was careful, detailed work, and it turns out old habits don't retire when you do." I pulled out the folder I had carried in my handbag. "Gerald Forsyth," I said, looking at him directly. "Forsyth Partners has been systematically overbilling municipal contracts through a structured pattern of change orders designed to stay beneath the threshold for independent review. I have documented 17 instances across 9 contracts over 6 years. The total excess billing I have been able to trace amounts to approximately $940,000 in public funds." The room had gone completely still. Gerald took a step toward me. "That is an outrageous fabrication." "I have copies of every document," I said. "Filed under FOI, cross-referenced against provincial infrastructure transfer payments. I have already provided a summary to a journalist at the Kingston Whig Standard. I have also provided a copy to the Ontario Auditor General's office. This is not new information to them. They have had it for 2 weeks. I let that settle. There is also the matter," I continued, "of the relationship Gerald has maintained with a woman in Ottawa who has a procurement review function on 2 of the contracts I've described. I am not here to discuss the personal dimensions of that. I am here because my daughter deserves to know what kind of institution she is being asked to join." Gerald's face had gone the color of old brick. Pamela had not moved. She was standing at the front of the room, still holding her wine glass. and she was staring at me with an expression I had never quite seen before on a person. It was the expression of someone who had always controlled the room and had just understood, for the first time, that she did not. I turned and looked at Claire. I should have told you privately. I tried to find the right moment, and I kept waiting because I was afraid. I am not afraid anymore. I handed the folder to the journalist I had identified in the crowd beforehand, a woman in her 40s whom I recognized from bylines in the Whig Standard. She had been there as a guest, a family friend of the Forsyths, which I had counted on. Then I put down the microphone and walked back to where I had been standing. What followed was not peaceful. Gerald moved toward the journalist and was intercepted by two of his business associates, both of whom, I later learned, had their own concerns about the contracts and had been watching quietly. Pamela set her wine glass on a side table with tremendous composure and walked out of the room without speaking to anyone, which I thought told you everything you needed to know about her. Daniel found Claire in the hallway and they stood together in the doorway to the kitchen while the room reorganized itself around them. Claire did not speak to me that night. She texted me at 11:30. I need a few days. I said, take as much time as you need, I am here. She called me 4 days later. She had asked Daniel directly about everything. He had known about the change orders. Not the full scope, he told her, but enough. He had not asked questions because asking questions had never been how the family operated. He had told her this sitting in their kitchen on Princess Street, not defending himself, not trying to manage the situation, just telling her the truth. They were not together anymore, at least not then. Claire needed time to understand what she had been standing next to, and Daniel, to his credit, had not pushed. Mom, she said on the phone. How long did you know? Since February, I told her. I started in February. Why didn't you tell me before the party? I thought for a long time before I answered. Because I didn't have enough yet. And because I knew you would have defended him and I couldn't bear the possibility of being wrong about your happiness. She was quiet for a moment. Were you scared I'd be angry with you? Terrified, I said. She laughed. It was a wet laugh, the kind that lives next door to crying. I know, Mom, I know. The Whig Standard published the story on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the party. It ran above the fold, which I was told was unusual for a local paper in that era of print media. The journalist had done her own verification and added 2 sources I hadn't known about. Former employees of Forsyth Partners who had been trying to find someone to talk to for almost a year. The Ontario Auditor General's office opened a formal review within the month. The process was slow, the way these processes always are, but it was real and it was moving. Gerald engaged a law firm in Toronto. Pamela issued a statement through that same firm, calling the allegations politically motivated, which meant nothing and was not followed up on by anyone. 3 of the municipal councils involved launched their own internal reviews. 2 of them quietly canceled ongoing contracts with Forsyth Partners pending the outcome. The woman in Ottawa resigned from her position in June. Gerald's lawyer confirmed in a filing that the personal relationship had existed. Gerald did not deny it. Daniel reached out to me in July. He asked if he could come to Belleville to speak with me. I said yes. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had poured tea for Claire when she first told me about him, and he looked older than he had in March. Not in a bad way. In the way of someone who had been carrying something heavy and had finally put it down. Mrs. Calloway, he said, I owe you an apology. I should have asked harder questions a long time ago. I didn't because it was easier not to. That is not an excuse. I just want you to know I understand that now. I poured him coffee. I asked him what he was going to do. He had left the firm, he told me. He had consulted an employment lawyer and had been cooperating fully with the auditor's review. He was looking at working for a municipal engineering department in Ottawa, something straightforward, something he had built with his own name. He asked about Claire. I told him she was doing well. Teaching, gardening, spending weekends with her friends. She had taken up running, which was new. He nodded. He looked at the table. He didn't ask me to put in a word for him, and I respected that more than anything else he had done. Pamela called me once, in August. I almost didn't recognize her voice. She sounded smaller somehow, which was not something I had thought possible. She said she had not known about the contracts. She believed this, or she had chosen to believe it, and there was no way for me to know which. She said she had not known about Ottawa. I told her I believed her about Ottawa. I did not tell her what I thought about the contracts. She had lived in that house for 30 years. I was not prepared to accept that she had simply not noticed. But she surprised me with what she said next. "I was terrible to Claire," she said. "I said things in front of people that I would not have wanted said about my own daughter, and I thought I was being gracious. I didn't say anything. I am not asking you to forgive me," she said. "I don't expect that. I just want you to tell her that I said it. If that is something you're willing to do, I said I would pass it along." I told Claire, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I appreciate that she said it. I'm not sure it changes anything." I told her it didn't have to. By September, she and Daniel had started talking again. Not back together, not in any formal way, but talking. He had moved to Ottawa. She had driven up once, and they had spent an afternoon walking by the Rideau Canal, and she came home thoughtful and steady in the way she gets when she has decided something about herself. She told me she was not ready to trust him yet, but she was not close to it either. "That is all I could ask for," I told her. The formal findings from the Auditor General's review were released the following spring. The total in irregular billing across the reviewed contracts came to just over $1.1 million, somewhat more than my initial estimate. 2 municipal procurement officers faced disciplinary proceedings. Gerald Forsyth was personally named in a notice of assessment from the CRA for undeclared income, which, given how these processes work, would take years to fully resolve. Forsyth Partners was dissolved as an operating entity. The assets were taken in by a numbered company controlled by a bankruptcy trustee. I read the report at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with a cup of tea, and I felt something I hadn't quite felt before. Not satisfaction exactly, more like completion, the way a logbook feels when you close it. I thought about the families in those municipal areas where the contracts had run, the roads and buildings paid for with public money, the people who had trusted that someone was watching. I thought about how many years those irregularities had run before anyone said anything. I thought about Frank and Robert and the journalist who had done her own digging, and the municipal clerks who had handed over FOI documents without knowing what they were helping to build. I thought about Pamela, who was living in a condo near the university now, according to what Daniel had mentioned to Claire. Whether she was at peace with anything was not something I had a way of knowing. And I thought about Claire. She called me that same Tuesday evening. She had read the report too. We talked for 2 hours, the way we used to talk when she was in university, and I was still figuring out who I was on the other side of widowhood, both of us just talking into the quiet. She told me she and Daniel were going to try. Properly, carefully, without the family structure around them, just the two of them building something from the ground up. He was honest with her now, in a way he hadn't been when everything had been comfortable and easy. She thought that meant something. "I think it does," I told her. She said, "Mom, are you okay? You sound like you're thinking." I told her I was always thinking. She laughed. "Dad used to say the same thing," she said. "I know," I said. "I know he did." There is something I want to say to anyone listening who has found themselves sitting across a table from someone who makes you feel small because of what you have or haven't built. I spent 31 years in an office going through numbers that other people had put together and assumed would never be examined closely. The one thing those numbers taught me is that nothing is as solid as it appears from the outside. Power built on performance is not the same as power built on truth. I am 64 years old. I raised my daughter alone after my husband died, and I watched her become someone extraordinary with no help from anyone who had a mansion in Kingston or a seat on a hospital gala committee. She did it because she was made of something real. When Pamela Forsyth stood in that room and told 200 people that my daughter needed to learn a different world, she was right about one thing. Claire does live in a different world. One where people are worth what they actually are, not what they've convinced others to see. I am not an impressive person by most measures. I drove a 12-year-old Civic until last autumn. I make lentil soup on Sundays. I spent my career in a government office that most people couldn't locate on an organizational chart, but I know how to read a document. And I know that the truth, once it is properly organized and laid out in sequence, is the most powerful thing in any room. If someone in your life is making you feel like you need to apologize for where you came from, pay attention. Not to the feeling, to them. Look closely at what they are protecting and why they need you to feel small in order to protect it. Because people who work that hard to keep others beneath them are almost always standing on something they don't want anyone to examine. And I have spent my entire career examining exactly that.